Hello, all you psychology students out there. Um, it's Mr. Brish, and obviously I'm not with you today. I am on a field trip with my daughter. The kindergartners are going to the pumpkin patch, so she asked me to come along. So I said, "Sure, I'd love to come, sweetie pie." So I am with her traipsing through a pumpkin patch, and I think it's supposed to be cold too. So in the cold, that'll be great, right? Um, so I wanted to record this for you and leave it for you so that we could start talking about memory. And actually, I'm a little bit ahead of myself with my memory slide. Um, First, before I get into the PowerPoints and everything, I would like to say a couple things about the beginning of the quarter. The good thing about starting over again at the beginning of the quarter is that you get a fresh start. You start over with an A, essentially, right? So no matter if you came in late last time, if you couldn't make up the credit because you came in too late and you couldn't, you had all those classes to do and everything, none of that matters anymore, right? You're starting over again with a brand new slate. That goes for all your classes, really, right? So so make sure that I just wanted to make sure that you knew that you starting over right now, and everything is going to be good for this quarter, right? Because everybody's starting in the same spot. Okay, so let's get talking about memory. So what you're going to need to do is get out your notes, and you can pause me while you do that. All right, I will assume that you have your notes ready. We're going to answer this question today. What are the stages of memory storage and retrieval? So we want to know what the process is for memory storage and retrieval. Okay, so first we need a definition of memory. And the definition is the process of encoding, storing, and retrieving information. So remember, when you're taking notes and you want to write something down like that, feel free to pause me. I'm just going to talk kind of like I normally would talk since it's just me and the internet's here right now. So pause me and go back and fill in what you want. But remember, when you're taking notes, don't write down everything that's on the slide. Don't write down everything I say. Write it down. Summarize what we're saying in your own words. That's what you should be writing down. Does that make sense? Definitions are one thing, but um, the purpose and stuff is something else. Okay, back to definition. It's the process of encoding, storing, and retrieving information. So there's going to be three stages of memory processes. And the purpose of memory, for simple organisms, it's to allow them to learn and adapt based off of previous experiences. So, if an organism goes next to fire and gets burned, then it wants to be able to remember that fire equals pain, fire equals damage, fire equals, possible death, right? So it wants to make sure that it knows not to do that again, right? So that's the purpose of memory to a simple organism. To something more complex, like your mammals, like humans, like other animals like dogs and that sort of thing, they're able to connect information together. The more complex the brain, the more information can be tied together to form more complex concepts. So the first step in any memory is encoding. And what encoding does is basically takes the sensory input, the visuals, the auditory things, the smell, the taste, whatever it may be, the tactile, the touch, all the senses, right? It takes that information and basically writes a construct, which is what you would call the memory. It's a little group of neurons and a specific pathway in your brain that has all that information, what it smelled like, what it tasted like, what it felt like emotionally, what it sounded like, what it visually looked like. And that's called a construct. So that's an important piece of information to write down. You want to know what a construct is. And then the construct is stored in the brain, right? So think of the construct as the PowerPoint slide in your brain for that particular memory, right? So it takes all the video that your eyes are recording, all the sound that your ears are hearing, all the emotions that you're feeling, all the smells that you're smelling, and encodes it into one little easily packaged kind of thing called a construct. And there's different kinds of encoding based off of the primary method of retrieve or of experiencing the information, right? So if you primarily saw something, that's what's called visual encoding, right? And that's like mental pictures. So if you are, remember last time we talked about what kind of learner you are. If you're a visual learner, this is your primary method. The best way that you remember things is with mental pictures. And then there's acoustic encoding. It's like sound info, right? So if you like to listen to me talk at you right now, if you're interested in music and you can remember the lyrics to a song, then what you're doing is acoustic encoding. That's why my daughter just asked me, she's 5, my daughter just asked me the other day, Dad, why do they keep repeating the same words in a song over and over again? And I said, the reason why is so you remember it, right? That's why they repeat things in poetry and music, so that you remember. Or because they can't come up with something else to say. um, the third method of encoding is the one that allows you to transfer things from short-term to long-term memory. And we'll talk about that in a second. But it's called elaborative encoding. And that's when you take some new information and some old information and you find a way to join them together. That's what's going to make it last longer in your brain, obviously. And that's one way to improve your memory, is with elaborative encoding. You take new info and then you add it to your old constructs. So it becomes a new construct, an added construct in your mind. Okay, so after you've taken in all this information, right, and you've made your PowerPoint slide in your brain of the memory, it's got to go somewhere, right? It's got to be stored. So let's talk about how your brain stores things. First, the goal is that you want to keep some information so that it can be easily recalled, right? So that you can go back to your PowerPoint slide and be like, yeah, I don't remember the definition of memory. Oh, bam, there it is, right? So just like I just did that, your brain does that all the time. That's called short-term memory, right? It's info that is relatively close in time from where you are right now. Another feature of that it's easily forgotten. If you don't do this elaborative encoding with it, that we talked about in the last slide, if you don't do that, it's going to fade away. It'll dissolve because that pathway that you've built in your brain with the neurons, eventually, when you want to remember something else, that pathway will get used in another way, in another direction, for some other information. So it'll just keep rewriting over the same thing. So it's like saving a file on your computer. If you have a Word document, and you're typing away, and then you made some changes and you save it again, it saves a different file, and it'll save a different file, and it'll save a different file, and it'll save a different file. So that's what's happening in your brain too. So if you don't take that file and move it somewhere else, right, into a bigger hard drive, let's say, if we're using that analogy, then it's not going to be stored for very long, right? As soon as you rewrite it with a different memory, then it's just going to overwrite it, and it's like it never happened. And one other thing about short-term memory is that basically you can remember 7 items plus or minus 2. So if you get above 7, or if you get above 9, then you're going to find a really hard time remembering the information. So there's a reason why your phone numbers are 9 digits long. Or well, I guess they're under 9 digits, right? Because everybody remembers the area code. So really, phone numbers are 7 digits long, right? Instead of the 10, right? That might be a little bit too much to remember. But everybody's got in their brain an idea of what area code you're working with. It's either 303 or 720 in our case, right? So all you have to do is remember the actual number that someone gives you, and then you can try out 720 or 303. But think about, as we're going through this PowerPoint slide and you're taking notes, you're only going to remember in your short-term memory 7 or so things from the PowerPoint, which is why I don't like to do like overly long drawn-out PowerPoints. We did one really long one, and that was with the theories, and that would be hard for you to remember. You'd have to do the elaborative encoding in order for you for it to stick in your mind, for you to be able to go then a month later and on the actual test be able to reproduce it, you know? Okay, so we have the short-term memory. Then there's the long-term memory. The long-term memory, through repetition and from the frequent use of the information and the connections it makes between things, remember we were talking about elaborative encoding? That's what makes it long-term memory. So the more you repeat something, the more you use the information, the more connections you make with it, the better it's going to stay in your brain, the longer it's going to be stored in your mind. Your long-term memory, like the hard drive on a computer, has a whole lot more capacity than the short-term memory, right? Because the short-term memory is going to get overwritten all the time. The long-term memory, though, is an actual storage unit. It's like a file cabinet. It's like a hard drive that you don't mess with. You just put things into it, right? You occasionally get something out of it, but for the most part, you put things into it, right? So the greater the connection, the more you repeat the information, the more you use the information, the better you're going to remember it. Which is why when you're studying for tests or when you're studying to remember something, or if you need to, I don't know, you're preparing for your driver's test and you need to know the rules of the road, you need to repeat them, you need to go out and use them and practice them, right? And you need to make connections with other things in your mind. That's how you're going to remember it. Okay, so you repeat a lot, right? Then it also has much greater capacity, and it must be occasionally recalled to be remembered. So this is really important. You can take something and put it inside the storage unit, but if you never dust it off and open the storage, you are never going to remember it. It's gonna be locked in the storage room, and then you're gonna have different pathways that are gonna end up being formed around it, and it's just going to be like this thing never existed. It's just going to be sitting there all by itself, right? And the new pathways you've made with information and other things that you recall all the time, say you're thinking about your first kiss with your special someone, right? Then that thing you're going to recall quite often, right? And it's going to maybe replace this other event. I don't know, the first time you got broken up with or something. If you never recall it, it's going to fade and fade and fade and fade and fade until you can barely remember it. So long-term memory has to be used occasionally. Otherwise, you're not going to remember anything. All right, and then the final stage is retrieval. So after you've had the sensory input and you've put it on a PowerPoint slide, you've taken your PowerPoint slide and put it on your hard drive, and saved it in the bigger hard drive on your computer, then of your mind, then you have to retrieve it somehow, right? So how do you do that? Well, retrieval is the accessing of information from either the short-term or the long-term memory. So retrieval counts from your short-term memory, the stuff that you just learned about, you're just trying to remember, and then the longer-term memory, the stuff you've built connections with and repeated a lot. Reminders here. So there's 4 aspects that affect your retrieval, and I bet you can think of an example of these that happened to you sometime. I put Dory up here, right, because she can't remember anything. And there's a reason why. So the 4 aspects that affect retrieval. Number 1 is attention. The more attention you pay during the encoding stage, the easier and faster it's going to be to retrieve the information. So if you're fully focused on something, and you're getting the visual input and the auditory input and the tactile input and the taste input and everything else, and you're fully focused on it, then you're going to be able to retrieve it faster. If you're like the dog from Up and you're like, squirrel, then you're not going to be able to retrieve it very well because your attention is not focused on it. Okay, then there's motivation, right? The more motivated you are to remember it, the more likely you'll be able to recall it. So if you're into a situation, you're defusing a bomb, and someone says, hey, don't cut the red wire, cut the orangey yellow wire, and you're like, what? What wire? And he says, orange yellow, and you're like, oh my God, okay, so you're really motivated to cut this wire because if you don't, you're going to explode, right? So the more motivated you are, the more likely you're going to be remembering something. The third thing is called interference. And this is Dory's problem, right? Um, she can't, take things from short-term memory and put them into long-term memory very well. And this is her problem. It's interference. So if you have made a memory, right, and it's sitting ready to be encoded, right, and you're just waiting for you to start repeating it and for you to make connections with it and everything, but then you make a new memory, right, this one is going to be forgotten, and now you have a new memory, right? And then, if you get distracted for 15 or 30 seconds, and you're looking away, right, then this memory is just going to dissolve, and then, you're like, what was I doing? This happens to us all the time. This is why we forget our keys, like where we put them. This is why you can be talking to someone and they're distracted and not paying attention to you, and then they're like, what, huh? What? You said that? What? Who? You know? So there are two things with interference, right? If you recall something between making the memory and storing the memory, between encoding and storage, if you make a new memory, the old one will be forgotten. It only lasts for 15 to 30 seconds. So if you're distracted, the short-term memory, gone. Okay, and then there's the fourth thing called context. So when you're trying to remember something, the recall is helped by being in the same location, having the same sensory input. That's why when you're trying to remember something, a lot of people go back to so if I forgot my keys, they go back to the location, they sit in the same spot, they look around. All right, I was thinking of, what was I thinking of? I was thinking of how close the Bronco game was this weekend. And then I was talking to my friend, and he said, hey, you know what? We should go out for Jamba Juice later on. And I was like, man, Jamba Juice would be great. And then I got up and walked away, and I left my keys. Oh, I knocked them on the floor right there, right? And then you go pick them up and you have them, right? Because recalling something is helpful by getting the same sensory input that you did when you made the memory, right? So you want the same sounds, the same visuals, the same emotional feelings, the same tactile sensations, right? You want everything to be the same, and it'll help you remember it. Okay, so we got four things for retrieval: attention, motivation, interference, and context. Those are the ways that help you remember best. Okay, now we have two other slides left, and these slides talk about different kinds of memory. This is called sensory memory. And this is the actual senses that are used in creating the memory. Does that make sense to everybody? So, every time you're making a memory, all info from all your senses, right, are being stored in short-term memory. But this is happening constantly, all the time, right? Like I'm sitting in this room and it's kind of cold, and I've been thinking for the last 5 minutes, man, my feet are cold in here. I don't understand what's happening with that, right? But I'm going along with my PowerPoint presentation here, so I'm not, I'm going to tough it out because I'm a hockey player, right? I don't care. It's cold or not cold. Actually, cold is good for hockey. So, I'm toughing it out, and then I hear something knocking on the door. Something's knocking on the door right now, right? I hear people in the background talking from the class that's, like the ROTC classroom that's over here, right? I'm kind of distracted because somebody walked past earlier, right? All these things are hitting me all the time, right? And are hitting you as you're watching this even, right? You could be thinking, man, it's cold in my house, or, my hand is cramping from writing all these notes, or, God, will he stop talking? All he does is talking at me in the same voice, right? So info from your senses is always being encoded in your short-term memory. Most of it just fades away, right? Because you're not going to encode, hey, it's a little chilly in here right now, or man, my nail is just a little chipped or something. You know what I mean? You're not going to encode everything that you sense. You know what I mean? But it can be extreme amounts of detail in a short period of time. Think about some traumatic event that happened to you. Often people can remember the sounds, the sights, the way it tasted, the way it smelled. The immediacy of it felt like it was, you can recall it such that you can remember it like it happened 5 minutes ago. That's because of sensory memory, because sensory memory can be there can be so much input, so much detail. But, your sensory memories last for 1 or 2 seconds, and then they're gone. You can make them a short-term memory if you really focus on them. If you like we were talking in the last slide, focus your attention, right? You don't have a lot of distraction or interference. You can make it into a short-term memory, but it takes a lot of concentration to make a sensory memory a short-term memory. Because, there's way too much sensory information for you to be long-term storing it all the time, right? There's way too much. Now there's something called muscle memory, and I put it in quotes because it's not actual memory. It's people call it muscle memory, but it's really an action that's repeated enough that it almost becomes instinctual, where you really don't have to think about it. And it comes from a kind of memory called procedural memory, which allows you to do things without consciously thinking of them. It's kind of in the layer below your conscious thought. Freud would call it your preconscious level, right? Call it in that kind of area. And that kind of memory we use, a lot of us use all the time in the form of driving, right? The more experience you get with driving, the less you're actually thinking about the rules of the road, and you're just doing it, right? But there's all sorts of other procedural memory. So all of us who are athletes out there, think of athletic event that you do well. I'm going to talk about learning a slap shot, but it could be riding a bike, it could be a particular move in soccer, it could be how to tackle correctly in football, it could be how to shoot a fadeaway jumper, right? Any of those things. And really, the idea of muscle memory is that it's movements repeated over time until they can be performed without you even thinking about it. Now, when you are 5, like my youngest is, my daughter, I can throw a ball at her head, and it's like a 50-50 chance that it hits her in the face. Luckily, I don't throw basketballs at her face. We throw little Nerf balls or something, so she's laughing most of the time. My son, who's 8, though, I throw the same ball at his head. It never hits his face. He blocks it 100% of the time or catches it. Right? That's because we've played catch, right? We've thrown football, we've thrown baseball. We've played basketball together, we've played hockey together, right? So he's had a lot of experience, right, with catching things and using his hands and blocking things down and that sort of stuff, right? So he can do it. He's 8. He can do it all the time, right? But my 5-year-old, she's like trying to catch it like this, and it's like whacking her in the face, or she gets lucky sometimes and actually gets her hands on the thing and catches it, right? So she hasn't repeated it over time enough yet, right? My son has, though. My example that I'm going to use right now is a slap shot in hockey. Now, I'm late to hockey. I played soccer all from when I was like 5 all the way up until I blew my knee out when I was 17, right? And had to have knee surgery and all that stuff. But so I was a soccer player, and then when I went to college at the University of Northern Colorado, right behind my dorm room, they set up. It was a tennis court before, and it was kind of like one of those chain link fence enclosed things. And one day they decided to put like nets out there. So my friend and I were like, "What are those?" We're like, "Oh, look, it's like hockey nets." And he says, my friend Ben, he's like, "Hey, you want to learn how to play hockey?" I was like, "Yeah, we're not doing anything else today, right? So let's do it." So we, got skates on. We went and, bought some cheap sticks from, I don't know, like Target or Playground Sports or something like that, and a puck. And we went out there and we learned how to play hockey. Now, I had no idea how to do a slap shot or anything else, and we had a lot of time on our hands. In college, you end up with quite a bit of time if you don't have to work all the time. So, I spent my breaks working, so I had some time left over. So what I did is I would go out there and I would just practice all the time. I would watch the Avalanche came to town the same year that I started college. So I would watch how they do it, and I would look at the screen. Oh, let's say that's how you do slap shot. Then I would go out there and I'd practice. Right now I can do it without thinking. Right. Last night, for instance, right when I was in my hockey game, Eric won the face-off, right back to me. I just grabbed it and shot without even thinking about it, right? So I can do it now because I've done it, 10,000 times, 20,000 times now, right? I can do a slap shot without really thinking about it. And that's what's happening to you too. So I mean, I could throw a football without thinking about it. I can throw a baseball without thinking about it. I can ride my bike without thinking about it. And in terms of thinking about it, I mean conscious thought, right? Because you've done it so much, then you can do it all the time, right? Okay, so that is the conclusion of our memory slides. I got some cool pictures from Wikipedia there, and memory psychology I used from Psychologist World. It's a psychological magazine. It's pretty nice, especially about the encoding and retrieval parts. Um, so what we've learned so far today is a little bit about the definition of memory. We talked about encoding, right? We also talked about storage of memories and what we do when we store them, and how you get them out of your mind to talk about them. And we also talked about a couple of things that aren't memories in the same way that you're thinking of, the sensory input that you get all the time, and muscle memory. All right, so hopefully this will help you on the quiz, because we have a quiz this week on memory. And this will also help you do the assignments, because what you're going to do is you're going to create your own like memory flow chart based off of what you've learned today, right? So this week should be interesting because you get to kind of learn about memory, and we're going to start repeating things so that you remember them, right? So what you're going to do basically is, for your assignment this week, is come up with like a flow chart from when you first have sensory input all the way through to when you can retrieve it and get it out of your long-term memory. Okay? All right, guys. You guys have a great week, and remember, this week you're starting over fresh, right? So if you start on this memory assignment, and you get proficient, then you have a B, right? If you get an advanced, then you have an A. You know what I'm saying? So make sure that you start over and start strong. All right, let's have a good quarter. All right, guys. You guys have a good weekend, and I will see you in class the next week. One more thing before I go, though. I want to remind everybody to keep your eye on the counseling page. We have a lot of information that's there all the time, and I'm updating it almost every day, right? So for instance, if you aren't keeping your eye on the counseling page, you wouldn't know that Pickens applications are due soon because, and I've also put a list of programs that have openings. So if you're interested in Pickens, make sure that you let me know, right? But there's also stuff on colleges. There's also stuff on upcoming events like the ACT Day that's happening on Wednesday this week. So, make sure that you're on there and looking at things so that you know. Okay? All right, guys, have a great week, and let me know when you have questions, all right? Call or text or email me. All right, guys, have a good week.